wrinkle drunk female fits perfectly into the brand of what Freeform presents in terms of trying to give us different takes on what it means to be a 20 something, maybe early 30 something year old in modern times. But in this case, it's focusing on the challenge of sobriety, especially when alcohol isn't just a rite of passage for a lot of people, but also how they get through their days and weeks. So, to give a brief overview of the first two episodes, Sam is a hot ass mess. She shows up to work drunk and gets fired. She gets into an accident that causes her to be on probation. She goes to rehab and relapses within the first two episodes, and she ends up having to move back in with her mom, Carol, who you can tell she doesn't have a good relationship with. Now, why is this? Let's just say that Carol is not somebody who's the most tactful person to speak with. But also, with Carol's husband, Sam's dad, dying, they kind of lost that mediator that usually would bring them closer together, or at the very least would help calm things. But with them living together now, the two are forced to deal with each other for as long as Sam is unable to support herself. Now, lucky for her, she has a sponsor in Olivia, and Olivia knows someone named Mindy who is the manager of a local grocery store. Now, of course, a grocery store paycheck is not going to support Sam, especially in the Boston area, which is rather expensive, but it's about baby steps of rebuilding herself, much less with her being on probation. She has to pay the state, and lest we forget, the car crash that she had that we mentioned was into a party bus for her best friend Britt, who's getting married to her ex named Joel. So she owes $5,000 on top of what she owes the court system. Never mind, because Carol wants to give Sam an incentive to get the hell out the house, because, you know, Carol's starting to date again. She also makes Sam pay rent. So to add up all these expenses, Sam has to pay rent to her mom, which is an undisclosed amount. She owes Britt $5,000, and of course she has to pay the state because of the damages she did. So it's not a terrible life, but it's definitely one with a lot of financial burdens. But silver lining, Felicia, who used to be her drinking buddy, they're still friends, and Felicia tries to stick up for Sam whenever possible. Olivia, while her wife Stephanie wants to make sure that there are proper boundaries in place when it comes to Olivia and the people that she sponsors, you can see that Olivia, to a certain point, is willing to be that go-to person for whenever Sam is in crisis. She doesn't want to be her mother. She doesn't want to be her friend, just a sponsor. And while that is a little hard to accept for Sam, since she really needs somebody, especially someone who's sober and kind of can guide her in a way that isn't just about the whole drinking thing, but because Olivia is a Peabody Award-winning writer and journalist, Sam looks at her as a possible mentor in terms of her professional life as well. So since back when Sam actually had a decent paying job, Sam was a writer. Granted, for some bootleg BuzzFeed type website, but nevertheless, she was getting paid for her articles. So she's hoping that with Olivia's help, maybe she can get back into that field and really do something that matters. But just to be clear, there is one kind of silver lining amongst all this. She meets a gentleman named James, and James, he too struggles with alcoholism, but he's been on the wagon for a while, and also is somebody that Sam hooked up with once when she was drunk. So there's history that she would like to continue, but it seems James applies that idea that he doesn't want her to go from an addiction to alcohol to an obsession with him to kind of compensate for the lack of drinking. Never mind possibly going to a sex addiction with him. So he makes it clear that if something were to happen romantically, it would be in a year and a day. Until that, he seems to offer his friendship, and for now, that seems to be good enough. So the first highlight is just showing that alcohol dependency varies by person, and for some it's a real issue like Sam, yet for others like Carol, it's not treated the same way. So, in terms of Sam, we see the extreme of it, and that's pretty much drinking to cope, drinking in order to be social, and pretty much alcohol being a crutch, one that you have to be constantly inebriated by in order to get through your day. But on the other end of things, you have people like Carol, Sam's mom, who drinks at the end of the day as a reward of some sorts, as a way of kind of relaxing. And you can easily see how one can become the other. And yet, some people, be it because of will or who knows what, kind of stay in that one lane, while other people decide they want to go to the far left lane and speed on ahead until they crash. And with that said, I think another highlight has to be that Carol, she wants to be supportive, yet she's imperfect in that role. For with having a husband that died of cancer, the idea of alcoholism being a disease doesn't necessarily sit right with her. And because she's on her own journey in her life, despite being quote unquote the smother, Carol's life doesn't revolve around Sam. Carol's dating this guy named Bob. She has this book club, and while we don't see or know of her working anywhere, she doesn't seem to be worried about Sam's every movement. And with that in mind, she's not necessarily learning all the terms that you would say to somebody that's trying to recover. She's not handling Sam with kid gloves. She's treating Sam like an adult who has less of an addiction or a disease and more so who makes bad personal decisions. And it's not the most terrible thing to watch. For let's look at it this way. A lot of us, especially in this generation younger, are well aware of the different type of mental disorders, the different ways you're supposed to talk to people in a politically correct manner, but while we see a lot of that on TV, that's not how everybody lives. A lot of people, they may understand what it means to be trans, to be alcoholic, to be depressed and all that, but it's one thing to read about it in a book, see it in a movie, commercial, etc., and then to have it in your life. And to have it in your life makes you actually have to deal with it and face it. And I think with Carol, she wants to be that supportive mother, but she doesn't want to sacrifice her own joy and journey for the sake of a daughter who she loves, but at the same time recognizes is a hot mess that has to clean up her own shit and not rely on her mother to pick up the pieces and do that for her daughter like she had to do for herself when her dad died. And depending how things were, maybe Sam didn't help her pick up the pieces, and you can kind of see this as the word retribution would be a little bit too dramatic, but I can definitely see this as a perhaps tit for tat situation. So she's handling her obligations as a mother, but she's not trying to go the extra mile in a way that maybe Sam is looking for or even needs. The next highlight is just there's so many cute couples on this show. You have Olivia and Stefani who have this real weird dynamic to them, since Olivia's this kind of quiet and demure person in a way. Meanwhile, Stephanie is like really intense. But alongside them, we have Bob and Carol who have this corny banter between them, which is just so adorable. And even in terms of like James and Sam, who are just introduced to us, there's just something interesting there about. I think it's because they both gone through stuff when it comes to drinking. Sam, getting into accidents and causing a little bit of chaos, and apparently James getting drunk and kidnapping people's dogs, which was random, but okay. And because of them both being alcoholics, and on top of that, in recovery and having a history because they hooked up once, you can get behind it. And when you add in that little date that they have, which I don't know if it was actually an official date or just them hanging out, you saw a good chemistry between the two where even if we're told it's going to be a year and a day before Sam is really ready for a relationship, as the preview show, James is gonna break that whole little you gotta wait for a while before we can get together thing. And I just hope so much that if they do get together, it doesn't lead to them both relapsing or some trouble kind of happening. Since they come off very much like an endgame couple, but who knows if they're gonna actually take us down that road or not.